Hello again. During the COVID epidemic, there was a lot of debate about vaccination and the extent to which it might be permissible to vaccinate children against the wishes of their parents. I'm sure that some viewers will remember that schools were giving the vaccination to children and saying that they could have it even if the parents objected. And there was a little bit of annoyance about that. It was seen as a radical and controversial idea at the time, and many people seem to think that the idea of compulsory vaccinations for children ran counter to all tradition in this country, where vaccination has always been a personal matter of choice. In fact, for the better part of 100 years, vaccinating your child was a legal requirement, and those who refused were liable to be fined or sent to prison. In the course of a single decade, 115 people were sent to prison for disobeying the law. Although very few people today remember when having one's child vaccinated was compulsory, there was a time in Britain when smallpox was a serious problem, killing thousands of people every year. And when vaccinations became available, it seemed sensible to the Victorians to make sure that what we now know as herd immunity developed. For this reason, in 1853 a law was passed called the Vaccination Act. The child of every parent in the country was obliged by law to see that their child was vaccinated against smallpox within 3 months of birth. This had the effect of reducing smallpox rates in the country quite sharply, although many people evaded the law and some of them ended up being fined, or if they refused to pay the fine, sent to prison. Because so many people were resisting vaccination, smallpox began to increase, and in the 1870s there was a fairly large epidemic in Britain of smallpox. Other laws were then passed and the government began to crack down on families who refused to have their child vaccinated. This meant during the 1880s over 100 parents were sent to prison. A number of organisations were set up to oppose the law, bodies like the Anti-Vaccination League, for example, and it gradually became clear that compulsory vaccinations were not something which everybody would go along with, whatever penalties were attached to disobeying the law. New laws were then passed with so-called conscience clauses, allowing parents to refuse vaccinations if they felt that they were unsafe. At first it was necessary to make out your case before a magistrate if one wished your child to be exempted. But in 1907 a new law was passed which allowed people simply to sign a declaration saying that they didn't want their child to be vaccinated. It wasn't until the National Health Act in 1946 that compulsory vaccinations were finally abolished in this country. I give a couple of links about this in the description to this video because it's not something which most people know about. Every so often, as happened during the COVID business, the idea is brought up again, but officials remember what happened in the Victorian era and know that such a scheme would be unlikely to work well. The last serious debate on the subject was during the whooping cough epidemic of 1978. In 1973 there was controversy about the triple vaccine given to children at that time, the one which protected against whooping cough, tetanus and diphtheria. In 1973 a doctor called John Wilson claimed that this vaccine could cause brain damage, and a lot of parents started refusing to have their children vaccinated. It was all eerily similar to the fuss about the MMR vaccinations a few years later, and the idea that this vaccine is associated with autism. The inevitable result in the case of whooping cough was, of course, a huge epidemic of whooping cough, a staggering 100,000 cases in England and Wales in 1978 and 79. An estimated 600 children died of the disease in the course of less than a year. Health officials were keen to get a law passed forcing parents to have their children vaccinated, but fortunately common sense prevailed. It says in scripture, of course, that there is nothing new under the sun, And this is certainly the case with vaccinations and the regular calls for them to be made compulsory. This particular debate has now been going strong in this country for 170 years.